Hello, CBS News listeners. On our first Twitter Spaces broadcast, we had a great conversation. A conversation with CBS News correspondent Enrique Acevedo and CBS Miami's Jim DeFede about the importance of the Latino vote and what's at stake in Florida. We hope you enjoy their insights. I certainly did. Take a listen.
It's great to be with both of you. Enrique, you had a great piece on the show this morning about Spanish language radio down there in South Florida and the sort of contest over who would control the airwaves there and whether they'd be even-handed in treatment of the facts. Very influential subject and a great exploration of it. According to the advertising, we're supposed to be talking about the midterms and the state of Florida, what's at stake. If you guys have any opening thoughts you want to deliver, because you're the experts more than me here, although I'm a native of South Florida, I'm not a working journalist there. I thought we would just start with the big overview question of, is Florida still a swing state? Is it in play for Democrats at all? Jim, you want to take a swing at that?
Sure. I would say that that after this year's election, this midterm election, it is unlikely that Florida will be viewed as a swing state going forward. And I think the state is moving from being purple to red. I think it's, if you look at the trends, I think a lot of it has to do with the same, what we used to think about Ohio 20 years ago. Ohio used to be one of those states that Democrats tried to compete in and was try to navigate their way through. Now they don't really even compete nationally in Ohio. But here in Florida, we always thought of ourselves as a swing state. And I'll tell you the most indicative thing of why I think that Florida is in trouble for Democrats is the story that I'm going to be following most closely on election night. I don't think there's a lot of mystery as to what's likely to happen in the governor's race, maybe a little bit more mystery in the Senate race. But what I'm going to be looking at is here in Miami-Dade County, will Miami-Dade County turn red for the first time in a very long time? The last Republican gubernatorial candidate to win Miami-Dade County was Jeb Bush 20 years ago in 2002. Of course, Jeb being from here, favorite son, so a lot of things going for him. But since then, Miami-Dade has always traditionally been blue. Ron DeSantis, 4 years ago, lost Miami-Dade County by 21 points. He now seems poised to actually win Miami-Dade County this time around. Hispanic voting is a large part of that, but not the only factor. But no, in terms of the big picture, I think that in a lot of ways, from my conversations, my discussions with both Democrats and Republicans, even national Democrats have largely given up on Florida. Yes, President Biden was here just earlier this week campaigning for Charlie Crist. That was more as a personal debt to Charlie Crist because President Biden likes Charlie, committed to Charlie early on, that he would come down and do an event. It was far less strategic than it was personal for the president to come here. And last point I'll make about that is when you look at the president's travel schedule, this was the first time in 2 years in office that he actually came here for any type of political event. The only other 2 times he came to the state of Florida was after the Surfside building collapse and more recently after Hurricane Ian. So he's come down for tragedies, but has not come down to do party building or anything along that line in Florida because I think they've sort of checked Florida off as being too expensive and they would rather compete in places like Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and devote their resources there. So I think the story out of Florida this midterm is going to be Republicans are going to believe that Florida moves safely into red territory for them.
Wow. Enrique, is that your sense of things from your reporting as well?
No, I love what Jim's saying, the importance of South Florida, specifically Miami-Dade County in this election. And I say that because traditionally here in Florida, to go south, you had to go north, right? The northern you get in the state, the most sort of southern political environment you could encounter. And South Florida was a bastion of democratic politics and the last solid blue part of the state. And that's been changing. It's been changing in places like Doral. That's, I think, just for the 25th. And Doral is important because it's a Venezuelan American community Tony, Venezuelan Americans have become the fastest growing Latino group in the United States. And between 2000 and 2020, they saw a growth of over 500% in the country, according to a recent report by UCLA. And in 2016, for example, that city Doral, which is called Doralzuela in Spanish because it's really a Venezuelan American neighborhood, voted heavily for Hillary Clinton. I think she won that city by over 40%. And then President Trump in 4 years was able to flip that city, and he won in 2020 by 2 or 3% by engaging with Venezuelan Americans. That was an impressive swing. And I think we're seeing some of the same dynamics play out in places like Miami-Dade County, which is the most Latino congressional district at Florida 27th in the entire state of Florida. By the way, Maria Elvira Salazar, who was one of the protagonists in our piece this morning, she's the congresswoman, the representative for Miami-Dade County for Florida 27th. One thing I find very interesting about this, Tony, and I know you commented on this morning, is the Cuban American vote. Traditionally, it has been a reliable constituency for Republicans, solid conservative group. But now with the arrival of Venezuelans, Colombians, Central Americans, Brazilians, even Mexican Americans like myself into the state of Florida, the presence of Cuban Americans in the Latino electorate has diluted, and they're now not the majority of the Latino vote. So Cuban Americans in the state of Florida are not the majority of Latino voters, of eligible Latino voters in the state. And still, we're seeing, going back to your original question, the state trend even more conservative, become even more Republican. So I think that also, in a way, validates Jim's argument that after these midterm elections, it's going to be hard to describe Florida as a swing state.
Wow.
And can I pick
Please.
up on something Enrique said? So a couple of things, just for folks outside of South Florida. Doral is within Miami-Dade County, so that's why we're talking a lot about that. Again, from the politics standpoint, you look for signs. What does the White House and administration do in the days leading up to and weeks leading up to an election? And one of the things that caught a lot of people's attention down here was that President Biden made the decision to reinstitute Donald Trump's policy of holding Venezuelans on the Mexican side of the border to seek asylum rather than allow them entry into the U.S. Now, let's talk crass politics for a second. If you thought that Florida was in play, if you thought that Miami-Dade was a county that you could still really win and then move on to trying to take on the rest of the country, you would not try to risk potentially upsetting the large Venezuelan population down here by doing a executive order like that, holding Venezuelans on the Mexican side of the border rather than granting them entry. That tells you that they were more worried about the immigration issue in other parts of the country than they were in how it was going to play here. The second point, and I'm sure we're going to get into this in more detail, the Cuban American. Enrique is absolutely right. As Colombians, Venezuelans, Salvadorans, others have come into Florida, the number of people who are of Cuban descent has shrunk in terms of the overall number. They're still the single largest bloc. But I think where the Democrats have made a serious miscalculation, and what's cost them is Democrats always believed that demographics was destiny. That as the older Cuban population, in a tactless way, I'll say, as older Cubans died off and their children and grandchildren came, were more American because they were born here, and they would be more accepting, and they would naturally become like other Hispanics and gravitate towards the Democratic Party. They assumed that was going to happen. In fact, that has not happened, in large part because Democrats have not made the case as to why Hispanic voters, particularly young Cubans, Venezuelans, Colombians, should be Democrats as opposed to Republicans. Republicans have been aggressively courting them for years now, and that's finally paying off for them.
So interesting. What you're both illustrating in the course of your answers is that people who look at political charts and graphs, read articles, and hear about the Hispanic voting bloc are getting a very simplistic view of what is in fact a very complex and varied population with a lot of different interests. Could you talk a bit about why the Latino voting population in Florida has not why Republicans, who the assumption from up north might be, oh, you've got a lot of Spanish people coming over the border, people who speak Spanish already in this country, they must be sympathetic and therefore not like the hardline Republican approach. But it's more complicated than that. Could you talk through the issue of immigration and how the Latino population already in Florida thinks about the politics of it?
Sure. I think, Tony, Latino voters, and that is a very, like you say, diverse and complex universe, but Latino voters care about the same issues that the general electorate does, mainly because the vast majority, around 75%, are U.S. born. So they care about the economy and jobs and rising inflation, and they care about, student debt loans and healthcare. They care about foreign policy. All of that is part of what Latinos care about as voters. But I think there's a set of issues where Republicans have done a good job of engaging with this group and its sub communities, and that's everything that has to do with what we call identity politics. And for example, now a growing majority of Latinos identify themselves as Christians, not as Catholic. If you look at Latin America, Catholicism was the most popular religion across the continent. And now, second, third generation Latinos in the U.S., when they establish themselves and assimilate more, now they are describing themselves as Christians and follow Christian values, which are more associated with conservative thinking and the Republican Party. So that's one element I think that has been underreported and I think plays an important role in understanding why there seems to be an apparent shift to the right among Latino voters. There's also country of origin and U.S. foreign policy towards this. So, like, if you think about, voters in the Midwest or in other places of the country, why would they care about U.S. foreign policy in Nicaragua or U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela and Cuba? Well, it's not a big deal for them. But for these voters, it's probably the main reason why they come out and vote or support one or the other party or support one or another candidate. So country of origin, U.S. foreign policy towards those countries. And I think that the last part of that is this attempt to label Latinos with a term like, it could be whatever, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. And there's a large portion of Latinos that did not like the term Latinx. And I mentioned this only because I was at an event recently, at a Marco Rubio and Governor DeSantis event with a Republican Mario Diaz-Balart, a representative from Hialeah, a important Cuban American community, and they asked people to raise their hand if they identify themselves as Latinx, and it was all Latinos in the crowd, and everyone booed, and so I think it's easier for Republicans to find these issues where there's an easy connection with a large part of the electorate, and it's harder for Democrats to talk about identity because even within the progressive or the liberal community, they don't agree in one term, right? A lot of people are comfortable with Latinx, other people are comfortable with other terms, and so it sort of gets more complicated. I think, just to be more concise, identity politics are playing an important role in this apparent shift to the right among Latino voters, especially here in South Florida.
Well, let's also jump, if I can jump in, let's
Please.
Also talk about, what I guess your piece was this morning and the larger issue of how so many in the Hispanic community get their news today. It is not from newspapers. It is not from traditional TV. Spanish language radio is a dominant force in terms of providing information. It can also be a dominant force in providing misinformation about the politics in the area and about candidates and about whether or not, we haven't even used the word yet, socialist. That is a powerful word in Florida that Republicans have harnessed, to brand all Democrats as socialists.
Why is it a powerful word in particular in Florida, Jim?
Because for so many folks who have come to the United States or who still have family back home, whether it is in Central America or Cuba or wherever it else may be, or in South America, they often fled a repressive socialist or communist regime. And so therefore they're coming here. You know, I'm going to use a very esoteric phrase. That's a trigger word. It evokes a lot of instant definitions of what someone is. Now, the view that when Bernie Sanders socialism is not the type of socialism you see in other parts of the country. Swedish socialism is not the type of socialism you see in Latin America. So therefore, Democrats have never found a good way to deal with that tag. You know, in the race, you talked about Maria Vera Salazar. Her opponent in that race is Annette Taddeo, who came here from Colombia, and one of her main selling points was that I will not allow myself to be branded a socialist. I will not allow these Republican attacks against me to stand. Her father had been kidnapped by the FARC, so she says, I'm not going to lay down for anyone when it comes to that. I understand better than most the problems that a repressive regime can cause. And so therefore, you are not going to win that argument against me. That was her main selling point as being the Democratic nominee, is that I can go up against Republicans who are naturally going to attack whoever the Democrat is as being a socialist. And in a lot of communities, that branding of someone as a socialist works very, very effectively. But that also comes about through just what Enrique was dealing with this morning on the show, was the idea of using radio in particular. And one funny side note, just so it's not all about what happens in South Florida, one of the funny things about Florida politics with Hispanics is Florida is a very expensive media market to advertise in. I know candidates, even local race candidates, who, when they want to try to get the Puerto Rican vote out in Central Florida, which there's a large Puerto Rican community in Central Florida, it is cheaper for them to advertise on radio stations and TV stations in Puerto Rico than it is in Florida. But they know that the folks in Florida with Puerto Rican descent will be actually listening to the radio stations in Puerto Rico, so their ads are actually more effective.
That's funny. Well, let's move on to a statewide issue then, and that would be the policy of Governor Ron DeSantis when it comes to COVID. And that policy was much more bold, open it up, defy the guidance from Washington, prioritize the economy and schools, and leave the public health to personal choice. And when he was doing that, he was a target nationally. People predicted that there'd be death in the streets and that he would suffer a political death when the time came. What's the reality now? Of course, he says he was right, and voters are going to get to weigh in on this. What's the feeling in South Florida about the legacy of COVID restrictions and Ron DeSantis?
Well, I think we saw a lot of voters voting with their feet already in terms of Governor DeSantis' policy. And what I mean by that is we saw a massive exile of people from California, New York, and other places around the country moving to South Florida, moving to Florida in general, Tony. So I do think we're going to see, this is the consequences of those decisions, of those policies. I think we're starting to see some of them, but we will have a better sense of whether this built a path to the White House for DeSantis, who clearly has presidential aspirations, or if it's going to be a challenge, an obstacle for those aspirations.
Yeah, but Jim, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
No. I mean, I was going to say, I think, he was harshly criticized at the beginning for this. My kids were out of school only for a couple of months here in South Florida. They are in pre-K and kindergarten, and everyone around the world was sort of making fun of Miami and South Florida, saying, you guys don't even take the pandemic seriously. But it ended up being good for the state and good for the local economy. If we can trust the official numbers, it also didn't have a profound impact on the trajectory of the pandemic here in the state.
Yeah, well, Jim, on the subject of the official numbers, I know that various people have tweeted at me today about there supposedly being an undercount of the death toll there in Florida. But I leave the answer to that question to others. I'm sure people will continue to dig into it. But if the death count were higher and more widespread, then we might see people blaming the governor for prioritizing opening up, and he'd be suffering political consequences. But all indicators suggest that he's in fact more popular than he was 4 years ago when he was running. And a big part of that popularity is his prioritization of freedom. His whole brand in the last 4 years has become, I'm the freedom candidate, I'm the freedom guy, and a big part of that is the COVID response. So, like, from the sheer math part of it, Jim, I mean, are there more people affected by COVID, or are there more people happy that the economy and schools were opened up?
I think that's the way you have to end up looking at it, is the latter. So let's be clear. There were at least 82,000 deaths in Florida. We should always, 82,000 families lost someone in the state of Florida to COVID. I think that what you said earlier, Tony, as well, was something very critical here. I think that in large part, well, let me say it this way. No single individual benefited more from COVID than Ron DeSantis. His trajectory, his national standing was jet propelled. I mean, just rocket fuel on his career because of his handling of COVID. And part of that was the media not handling this issue well themselves. And by that, I'm going to say this. I think that, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, I think the media loves a hero and they love a villain. And I think in the early days of the pandemic, they decided that the governor of New York, Cuomo, with his press conferences, was the hero, and Ron DeSantis in Florida was the villain. Florida, D-U-H at the end. And I think that set up a contrast for a lot of stories that were being written and told about COVID. And then when the governor of New York fell, and when we realized that he was cooking some numbers up there and trying to keep deaths from nursing homes out of the public spotlight, it caused a lot of people to say, see, the media got it wrong about Cuomo, so therefore they must have gotten it wrong about Ron DeSantis, and he's actually the hero it turned out to be. That's their view. Now, Ron DeSantis absolutely did some things correctly. Whereas New York did not shut down nursing homes, Florida immediately shut down nursing homes. One problem with that was they did not have the testing or capabilities to test employees inside nursing homes. So you had people still coming in and out. So I don't want to get into a deep discussion on COVID. I know you don't either. But you are right in saying that perception that he was the freedom governor, because we often forget he did shut down the state. He did close the beaches. He did tell everyone to stay home and the schools to shutter. He opened them back up, some would argue, when he saw the mood of the country turning against the restrictions. When he started hearing from more and more people around the country that they were angry by the restrictions, he jumped out and said, we're going to open things up in Florida. And, I don't think anyone can honestly say whether or not if he had done something different. I know scientists who will argue that if he had continued certain restrictions, maybe the 82,000 would have only been 60,000. But to your larger point, I think the vast majority of the 21 million or so Floridians wanted to get back to some semblance of normal, wanted that freedom, wanted to go to work, wanted to not risk losing their homes, wanted their kids in school because they couldn't deal with having kids at home and not working at the same time. It was a headache. It was a nightmare for a lot of people, the impact of COVID. And we should always acknowledge, too, we're seeing it in the testing scores. I know you both have reported on this.
Absolutely.
About how, because by keeping the schools closed, we are seeing that lag. And that's one of the things that Ron DeSantis has been able to cite and say, see, we opened sooner, our kids got back into school sooner, they're not as far behind as other kids. So, the politics of COVID got very, very difficult in Florida. Ron DeSantis appears, though, headed to riding that, and that freedom, that use of the word freedom, freedom. He uses it over and over again. That has really resonated with folks across the state, and that's why he's likely headed toward a re-election now and potentially to run for the White House.
Yeah, it does seem like he's headed for re-election with an expanded victory over what was a tight race in 2018. I had a remarkable experience, Jim, down in Florida about a week and a half ago, where we do this series called 3 Meals. You go to 3 different parts of a state and you you're at the mercy of whoever happens to be sitting down in a restaurant at that time. And you talk to them about politics. We went to 3 locations, 3 different parts of the state. We were in Midtown Miami, we were in Melbourne, and we were up in Jacksonville. These are areas that had been evenly split. There were definitely Democrats in the zone. And I must have talked to 50 people overall. I stood at a stop sign at one point, and just every car that pulled up, I said, "Are you a Charlie Crist voter?" And I went around the diner. I went to every table. There were 17 different tables. I said, "I'm looking for a Charlie Crist voter." I didn't find a single Charlie Crist voter in my travels. It was all Ron DeSantis all the time. It's not scientific. It's purely anecdotal. But man, that really struck me.
Yeah, he's very. I mean, the popularity that DeSantis has right now in Florida, I can't. I'm trying to think of another governor, and in part, it's what's interesting is, there used to be an old adage that the best politicians were who did you want to have a beer with? That was used to be the old test. Is this a guy that you want to have a beer with? George W. Bush was the kind of guy you want to have a beer with. Was Dukakis the kind of guy you want to have a beer with? Probably not Dukakis. To be honest with you, Ron DeSantis doesn't strike you as the kind of guy you want to have a beer with.
Yeah, which is surprising. As a former college baseball player, I know he played baseball at Yale. Like, usually baseball players are pretty good talkers and beer drinkers. So it's a question. It's interesting.
Yeah, but so he's not really that kind. Instead, what he's really put forward is that he's tapped into the anger as well in the electorate. His disdain for the media is unparalleled. I've never been to a press event or a press availability with him where he hasn't lashed out at least one reporter. That's the nature of him. Part of it could be because of how he felt he was treated during the COVID pandemic and the scenario that I described earlier, where he was going to be the villain. But every time, and you see it, and time again, he's tapped into that anger. I've never seen a governor use power, raw power, as effectively and as diligently as Ron DeSantis has. Wow. I've covered governors going back to Lawton Childs, more than 25 years ago. And I'm telling you that Ron DeSantis understands the use of power, whether it's no governor had ever decided to put out his own map for redistricting. The state legislature always redistricts congressional districts. They put out a map that was going to really favor Republicans. As a Republican legislature, you would expect to draw. That wasn't good enough for Governor DeSantis. He came forth with his own map that destroyed 2 African-American districts in addition to everything else the legislature did. Whether it's passing anti-woke bills, parental empowerment, which is also known as the don't say gay bill. These are measures, social justice issues, or these types of issues that he has decided to sort of take head on, that have less to do with Florida, I believe, and more to do with raising his national image, building on what the impression that people have from him from COVID, and showing him as a fighter. When I go to DeSantis events, and I was at one just this past weekend up in Ave Maria, a very Catholic religious community, he was up there, and I talked to a lot of his supporters. They talk about him being a fighter. They like the fact that he fights. He likes the fact that he thumbs his nose at the press, that he defies everyone, that he doesn't care about what people think of him. He's just going to smack you in the nose to get his way. Yeah. They like that down here.
Yeah. Yep. And a lot of questions about whether he'll run in 2024. Of course, there are other Florida politicians who have tried that. It hasn't worked out so well for Marco Rubio and for Jeb Bush, but it worked for Donald Trump. I've got let's springboard to the national question then, not only about whether he'll run in 2024, but, Florida, since I was a kid, people talked about Florida as sort of the future of America because it was getting more diverse. It's older, 2 qualities that the overall country is heading in the same direction. We used to talk about Ohio as a bellwether for the country, but I do think there's a case to be made that Florida is a bellwether for the country. Whoever wants to take up an answer to that. Do you feel like for Democrats, Florida slipping to the red is a very bad indicator for their national chances?
Well, specifically when it comes down to the question of diversity, Tony. Florida has the most diverse Latino population in the country. We don't see that sort of diversity in places like Texas or California, even in New York or Illinois, where you have large Latino populations, Arizona, Nevada. Florida really has a diverse Latino population, and it seems to be a trend when we talk about the future of demographics here in the U.S. And Latinos becoming a majority in more and more states. What that means is not Mexican Americans being 7 out of every 10 Latinos, as it is today, or 6 out of every 10. But it's seeing that mosaic of identities and countries of origin that we see in Florida. So I think that is problematic for Democrats because they're not connecting with those voters as they have with other groups within the Latino vote. What I think is fascinating, to be honest, is in the question of immigration. And I think this is also important and relevant to the conversation around Governor DeSantis. In the question of immigration, there's little reported on, and there's not a real conversation around how more Latinos are becoming anti-immigrant in their views, in their political positions. And what I mean by anti-immigrant is, so once they're here and they're able to establish themselves and assimilate, they want less immigrants to come into the country, even if that means people fleeing socialism in Venezuela and refugees, asylum seekers trying to get protections in this country from the same countries of origin as some of these immigrants. I think it's fascinating to see that the city of Miami has become the crown jewel of the Republican modern movement with the mayor Francis Suarez at the head of that. And at the same time, what's made Miami and what's made South Florida such an important economic force and an engine for the state is immigration from Latin America. Basically, the resources, the human capital is coming from there. And now they have this sort of parallel argument about, this is the future of the country. This is the way we want to make things everywhere, not just here in Florida. Look at how well we've been doing and say, but we don't want any more immigrants and we don't want any more people from Latin America coming here. So at some point, I think the Republican Party is going to have to agree on one message because they can't have their cake and eat it too.
Jim, what do you think Florida means for Democrats nationally?
I think this cycle, it's a harbinger of bad things to come. But, to your larger point of Florida is the kind of place where a lot of the issues that the rest of the country will be dealing with do take place in Florida, whether it's sea level rise, climate change, the effects of immigration, an aging population, healthcare, all those sorts of things end up coming through Florida. So Florida has always been sort of a laboratory. So from a political standpoint, going back to when Jeb Bush used Florida as a way to try to model certain things on education reform that was then duplicated in other parts of the country. I think what Ron DeSantis is trying to make the argument for is that the policies and the things that he is pressuring and forcing here in Florida, being able to use that as a template for other parts of the country. I mean, I think I watched a speech where he was either in New York. I mean, one of the most amazing things to me by the way, about Governor DeSantis is, with 10 days left to the campaign, he was in the state of New York campaigning for New York gubernatorial candidate Lee Zeldin. That's how confident Ron DeSantis is here. He's been to Arizona. He's been to Pennsylvania. He's been all over the country campaigning for others. And so he's not worried about Florida, but he's hoping to take the Florida model, so to speak, and apply it elsewhere, or to make it a selling point to say, what we're doing in Florida, we can do for the rest of the country. That's a phrase I've heard before, make America Florida again. So I think that's one of the things that is interesting out of Florida is Democrats have never figured out a good way to deal with what Ron DeSantis has done in Florida. And if they don't figure it out here, they're going to have to figure it out somewhere else if they want to try to stop these, whether it's him or his ideas spreading across the country.
In this moment of kind of political interleague play where the governor of one state will travel to another state and campaign for politicians there, and you've got national figures crisscrossing the country, Obama and Biden and Trump. It's notable, is it not, Jim, that, correct me if I'm wrong, Donald Trump has not appeared at a DeSantis event, has he?
So he has not. And Donald Trump has a rally in Miami this Sunday. It is a rally for Marco Rubio and for other candidates, but Ron DeSantis will not be there. Donald Trump has not formally endorsed Ron DeSantis this time around. For context, Ron DeSantis was elected governor, won the Republican nomination in 2018 because Donald Trump supported him. He was far behind in the polls. He had little money. He had no real chance at getting the Republican nomination. But what Ron DeSantis did was he campaigned heavily on Fox News. He appeared on Fox News throughout 2017 into 2018, defending the president against all the impeachment talk and all the other things that were going on in D.C. Because he understood that by getting on Fox News and saying nice things about then President Trump, that President Trump would see it. And sure enough, it worked. It was a campaign for one person, Donald Trump. And Donald Trump came out and said Ron DeSantis would make a great governor in Florida. And then Ron DeSantis ended up going headlong into it, get the endorsement, won the nomination, won the election by just 30,000 votes with Donald Trump's help. And since then, he has done a lot to sort of distance himself from Donald Trump. Having gotten the nomination, having won the election, you do not see the two of them ever together. Do, and he does not go out of his way to say things in defense of the president or to say things, and Donald Trump says the same things. They're like two wary boxers moving around a ring, not quite sure if they're about to get into it or not.
On primary night, Tony, I went to this event where Marco Rubio spoke. Rick Scott was there, I think, too. Maria Elvira Salazar, Mario Diaz-Balart, like all the Republican leadership of the state, and of course, Governor DeSantis. No one mentioned in their speeches, no one mentioned Donald Trump. That would have been unthinkable not too long ago. I mean, not even 4 years ago, just 2 years ago. An event of that caliber in a place like Hialeah, in the heart of the Cuban American community in Miami, to not have anyone mention President Trump. And then I went to a Trump event here in downtown Miami, and he never mentioned Governor DeSantis. So it's clear that there's a deliberate attempt to distance themselves from the other as the talk about a possible DeSantis run grows.
Well, yeah, we all remember the DeSantis ad reading Donald Trump's great works of literature to his son. And then Mr. Trump said, "You're fired." I wonder what Governor DeSantis thinks of that advertisement today. I'm guessing it's not on poster board around his office. I think we've given everyone a lot to think of here, and I would count myself among the people who have learned a ton. I'm going to be down in Florida doing some more election reporting for the midterms, and there was no better briefing than to talk to you, Enrique, and to you, Jim. So I really appreciate your time today.